please join me in virtually welcoming Joshua Danish, and I'll turn things over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you all for having me here. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So someone could give me a thumbs up that you see my PowerPoint. Okay, awesome. So thanks again for having me here. I'm excited to chat with you all. And I realized the talk I've been occasionally using overlapped a lot with what I presented a couple of years ago to this brown bag. So I figured I had to go come up with something new. So I hope nobody was looking for the update on that. So I've used this as an excuse to kick my butt into thinking through some ideas I've been playing with. So these are new ideas, although they're around projects I've been working on for quite some time. So if you have feedback at the end or ideas about how I can streamline some of this thinking, I'm certainly open to that. So what I'll be talking about is what I'm going to call academic play, and I'm going to frame that as representational practice to help make some sense of it. So what are we talking about when we say play? Play is one of these complicated things that's hard to define, but there are two assertions I think we see widespread agreement on. The first being that play is awesome. People just generally think play is great. And what do we mean by that? Play is developmentally necessary. We see a lot of literature about how this is key to helping children mature. It's also how young children meet unmet needs and how they develop a sense of self-regulation and control. It's also sometimes a form of inquiry, how they learn about the world, how they learn about themselves and think through who they are and who they want to be. It's also even been defined as a form of literacy, recognizing how play is tied to children's ability to understand and read the world and communicate. And of course, there's the semiotic function. Play is tied to representing ideas and et cetera. So in a nutshell, play is awesome. It is something that is considered widely valuable. But then if we get into the question of how do we know when we see play, what we most often hear is it's not work. And that's, to me, sometimes not all that satisfying. So there's a notion of free choice. Play is often what children or adults, because adults can certainly play, choose to do. Sometimes people associate it with creativity. They think about it as joyful, although scholars are quick to point out that a lot of things we consider play are not always joyful in the middle. So a lot of games are joyful when you're winning, but not so joyful when you're trying hard or losing. But we'd still generally agree that those are still a form of play. And of course, play does include games, and so games are a subset of that space, et cetera. So there's a lot of ways that people have talked about what play is, but often it's a little bit vague. And it's situated in this way that leaves it as just not quite work. So two of the questions that have been driving my thinking are, first of all, if play does all these amazing things, how? How can we, all too often, I think, our discussions of play are sort of correlational in the sense that they say, well, in play, these great things happen, but we don't understand enough at times about how they happen, and particularly if we want to design for play in our learning contexts. And also, how do we know when we see play? And I mentioned this play is not work piece because one of the comments I often get when we talk about putting play in classrooms is, well, is that even play if the teacher's helping control it? And so if play is just stuff that happens on the playground, that's fine and that's good, but I think we miss something there. So I want to unpack this a little bit and try to understand when it is we're seeing play happening. So the definition I like to start with comes from Vygotsky, who says that what sets play apart is not that it's fun, although it can be, but that it always has within it an imaginary situation and a set of rules. So for example, in my work, I often ask children to imagine I'm a bee. Let's start there. And what's powerful is that that imaginary situation has within it some rules about what it means to be a bee. So I know that bees live in hives. Maybe I know that they visit flowers to find nectar. And so what happens in play, according to Vygotsky, is that this imaginary situation creates a space in which children can explore the rules tied to that situation in new ways that are often challenging for them to do reflectively and productively without the play context. So Vygotsky uses an example of two sisters playing at being sisters as a way to connect to what that means to them more explicitly. But for me, it's more often something like this in science class. How does pretending to be a bee help a child connect with their ideas about a bee? So this feels to me like it's getting us part of the way there, but it still leaves a lot of flexibility in how we can support this sort of play in a classroom. And there's still a big question if we want to go into a design session and support learning through play. Well, what do we do, right? This is finding an imaginary situation is not enough guidance, I find. So how do we think about that? So just to spell that out, we've got, again, Vygotsky thinking about play as an imaginary situation, set of rules. It's also been pointed out that there is a meta-communicative frame, which is how we know it's play and not work. And so that's why when you play fight, nobody gets upset and runs away, although of course slip-ups happen. It's often voluntary. But the problem then is when we put play in the classroom and make it academic, what does that mean? At the very least, it usually means we've structured it, right? The teacher has now put some constraints in. And the problem is now we've got a contradiction. So if play is truly about being voluntary and about children inventing the rules, then is it still play when the teacher has started to enforce some particular rules? I'm actually going to argue yes, but I also think this is, it's in some ways the wrong question to ask. So to try and make some sense of that, I'm going to digress for a moment and talk about representations, and then we'll come back in just a moment. So what about representations? So here we see some more bees, and one of the questions I like to ask is, why do students in free or playtime make this bee on the left, and in science time make the bee on the right? If the same child can make both bees in the same day, it suggests, of course, that the issue is not their knowledge, but rather something else is going on. And so what I would argue is that they have developed representational practices that are tied to those contexts. And what representational practices involve are patterns in how we think about creating representations in activity. And in particular, there are patterns related to what we represent. So if we're representing the world of bees, what do we need to include? As well as how to represent them. So if I'm going to include, say, the eyes on the bee, why do they look one way on the left and a different way on the right? So just including them is not enough, but there are some ideas for how. And so here we see some particular ideas from classrooms I've been in. The eyes look a particular way. The proboscis is present and curled around because that's crucial to collecting nectar. A lot of our students really liked the pollen sac on the back leg where the bee can put some pollen. So this is evidence of a representational practice in action. And as you can see in the red here, these are tied to rules that are local to the classroom, but based in disciplinary norms. In other words, they're representing a bee that way because the teacher has conveyed to them that they should, but has done so in part because scientists have said these are important features. And finally, there are reasons for why we might want to represent a particular way. In playtime, this bee on the left is represented that way. In this case, it was actually, I think, a Mother's Day card. So it was represented as happy and cheerful because that's what the child wanted to say to mom. And on the right, it's represented this way because we want to convey accurate details in a science classroom. So now if we come back to this question of play, I hope it's not too much of a stretch to say, boy, this looks kind of representational, right? So there's some real overlap here in that there are some rules about what might be represented that are being made visible in this play context, and now we just need to account for how imagination fits in there. So what I've tried to do is stick these things all together. So here's a repetition of that notion of representation in a disciplinary context. There are normative ideas about what details we might want to represent, how we represent them, and why. And it's often high stakes, right? This is a professional world. And if we don't do this well, we don't get grants or paid or what have you. In contrast, in a free play situation, the children are often driven by their imaginary situation. Now they may be tapping into their ideas about the world, right? They don't make up bees completely from scratch. They're thinking about bees they've seen, but they're driven by their own ideas, their own local norms, and a lot is about choice, and the stakes are really low. So what I'm interested in then is this space in between that I'm now calling academic play, where we see a little bit of play and a little bit of representation and features of both, in that children are thinking about what they're imagining and using those imagined ideas as well as normative ideas to represent content and to think about and negotiate with each other how to represent it. And there are some tensions, perhaps, that arise between what the children want and what they represent, as well as, but there's also some real opportunities here. And in fact, what we've seen in some studies with young children is that they tend to start with the imagined until they learn the norms. So in other words, kids start with smiley face bees, and then when they learn they have to have compound eyes, they use those compound eyes. As so long as they're in science time, and they switch right back when it's fun time sometimes. So what I'm trying to do today is take this frame and explore what it means to think about academic play in this way. And one of the questions that I want to ask is, how does the organization of academic play therefore build on these imaginary situations and imaginary features to support engagement with disciplinary norms? Because to me, that's a big part of how we can bridge from free play towards representational activities. And one of the reasons I think this can be really valuable, or at least it has been for me, is that this makes it less crucial to define an activity as play and more important to think about what are the features that we think are relevant for learning. So here, you can probably tell I'm interested in how imaginary situation, flexibility, and agency support those representational activities. And that might feel like play to kids, but I no longer need to argue with peers at a conference whether that would count as play. And in fact, at the end of one of the studies, we asked kids whether what they had done is play, and they said, well, it was, can we call it plearning? Because it wasn't quite as fun as the playground, and it was so much better than worksheets. And so I'm not going to try and coin the phrase plearning, but I think it really solidified the idea that kids see this as a middle ground as well, that they see that flexibility and choice, but they also recognize they're in a classroom. So to show this new framework, that's the new part, in action, I'm going to share examples from two different research projects. This first one is the Science Through Technology Enhanced Play project. And this analysis is based on some work that one of my students, Cynthia Tu, led, and we're happy to share this paper if you want more details. Science Through Technology Enhanced Play is a technology platform we've developed, where if you look on the right here, you'll see what we do is we put Kinect cameras in the classroom, and they can track students in our activities. And so as the student moves around, they appear in the system as an avatar, in this case, a bee. So here you can see a student collecting nectar in the classroom, which was appearing on screen as a bee. And that would also trigger some symbolism on screen, such as seeing the quality of the nectar pop up. And there might be other features like a timer to help motivate them. And then students in the classroom can play an observer role to engage with their peers who are acting. And so here you can see that in action. So these children on the left are being bees. This is imaginary. They're pretending to be bees. And they're seeing the screen that you see on the right, which has some of the rules of being bees in it. So as they walk around the classroom, they're seeing ideas about pollen and nectar in that screen. And so this was designed from day one to build on this definition of play, that the imaginary situation helps us explore the rules. So in this research study, we had 48 students in first and second grade classrooms. And when they were split up into groups of 11 to 13 to participate in all of the activities. The group that wasn't participating would go off to the library just because it's hard to get that many kids moving around in one classroom. We used a 13-item multiple choice test, which showed that there was significant learning about bees. And you're welcome to hit me up for this paper if you want those details. But what's important to me for this is we then looked at the video to understand how they learned about bees. And in particular, we were interested in 2 days where they spent a lot of time thinking about pollination. And the reason was that we had 3 different pollination activities that ended up looking fundamentally different. And really fundamentally different in terms of whether you might consider them to be play or science modeling or something else. So it was a really nice space to compare what these types of activities might actually look like. So here I've taken that table to help represent that. We've got a bunch of rules we saw in the classroom, non-scientific rules, meaning that they came from either the imaginary or the game space, and then scientific rules that we were trying to cover. And as I'll show, there was a free play activity where children were trying to learn about how bees they work to get nectar, and then pollen just happens to stick to their body. And our colleagues at UCLA had done the exact same activity with stickers, and it worked beautifully for them. And as I'll show you in a few minutes, it didn't work so well for us, but the kids loved it anyway. And it looks a lot like play, and it doesn't look very much like representation. Then we had something sort of in the middle where kids were using our STEP platform. They were focusing on nectar collection in part because the rules were in there from the system. They were also playing around. And it feels a little bit more like something in the middle. And then finally we said, can you make a model of how bees really get nectar and show us what scientists know? And so this was much more driven by rules and norms from the field. But as I'll show you in a minute, there's still some imagination and some playfulness that makes its way in there and turns out to be really powerful. So even though we think of this as a bit of a spectrum from left to right, our goal isn't to say, this is good, this is bad, but rather to see how these features end up playing a role in that learning process. The word play comes into my talk way too much, but what kinds of functions they have. Okay, so in the free play, we asked students to use physical objects to explore pollination. And they were collecting stickers, which were meant to be nectar. And then the flowers were played by other children who were supposed to surreptitiously put stickers on their clothing to capture the notion of pollen getting stuck on you. So here we can see some of the kids in the classroom. So these kids are bees, and you can see them with some heart stickers there for different quality of nectar. And we had these big soft blocks that we were using as flowers because the technology can track them. And then we also had other children being observers in the background. So I'll show you a brief clip of what this looked like in action.
Thank you. Come all the way through. Now, bees, how can you tell when you've gotten enough nectar to fly back to the hive?
So that dramatic reaction is a great place to stop, in part because we see how the teacher tried to bring this back to the science goals, but the children were really just focused on smacking stickers on each other, going out and holding their hands out to receive the stickers, regardless of what their function was supposed to be. Here, there's a little bit of kids laughing in the background. And of course, the more the observers laugh, the more the kids want to ham up their performance of getting smacked by stickers. And it pretty quickly hit a point where we had a sidebar and said, maybe we should stop this. I don't know how they made it work at UCLA, but it didn't work here. And so when we look at this table, we see that those stickers just became way too fun. And crucially, that was because kids were focused on pollen, not nectar, right? We want them to understand that bees are looking for nectar and pollen gets on them by accident, but here they were walking around trying to collect pollen and then knocking each other down with their pollen. And so even though the teacher tried to redirect them, that got ignored. This was truly free play in that the structures we attempted to impose did not go through. And so at the end, we called this more free play because it really was driven by students, but it didn't, unfortunately, it didn't do a lot of the science work we would have liked. Although, again, it really didn't work out how we wanted, but I view this as a good opportunity to then understand the difference between how kids were playing in the free play and the more modeling type activities. Mm-hmm. And I mention that because, of course, we could go out and see kids on the playground, but if they're playing kickball on the playground or race cars, it's not a very useful contrast. And so here we at least get to see them doing some bee activities to understand the difference. So one of the next activities, we turned on the computer system, and here we wanted children to explore the space, pretending to be a bee, and really focus on collecting nectar again. And then the rules for the system in terms of nectar being intentional but pollen accidental were represented by the computer system itself. So as children collected nectar, there were new pollen dots being introduced to the system that they were not previously aware of. And then afterwards, we could make them all visible to see where pollen was traced across the field and which flowers would have reproduced as a result. So here we can see two children who were looking or acting as bees. And on the right side, you can see the bees on screen and some of the flowers that they would have visited. And of course, we again have observers, although you'll notice this time the observers are talking to them about how much nectar they have instead of simply laughing at their activity. So here we go.
Now let's go back on.
Okay, so one child just yelled out, "You're full," so that the girl goes back to the hive to drop off the nectar that she's found. And now the boy is almost full and he's going to go back as soon as he also has gotten it. And so the result there is that we get these suggestions, right? The audience is now focused on helping them collect nectar and act like bees. And that partially helped them orient towards this rule. That what became more salient for these kids was that they needed, that bees would stay out from the hive to get all the nectar they could. And then when they couldn't carry anymore, they'd go home. And that this would also lead them to other flowers, which would trigger pollination. And as they were exploring that space, again, they were listening to their peers now, as well as the teacher. So the teacher was able to inject some rules saying, remember, you want to get all the nectar you can and then go back. And so we were able to help shape this activity a little bit more, which again helped make some of those patterns visible, particularly when we played the video back. We didn't play back any video of the prior sticker activity, but I'm not sure it would have done anything for the kids. But watching the virtual bees fly around, they were certainly able to talk about how bees were trying to get nectar and what that happened to do to the flowers that were being pollinated. So here we're calling this intermediate activity because we see a mix of that imaginary situation driving what kids are doing and the scientific rules being explored and picked up and taken up by them. So that worked. It did what we wanted. And we were happy with how the imaginary situation helped, particularly with this tricky issue of recognizing that bees are not trying to get pollen. Because kids often start our studies assuming that bees are trying to help flowers pollinate as far and wide as they can, but it's actually really important that they learn that it's an evolutionary adaptation that the flowers draw the bees in, and this leads to pollination. So finally, we had an activity where we had introduced the term modeling very briefly as a scientific production that was intended to convey accurate details. And we asked the students to create a model of how bees really work. And we gave them the same blocks they had previously used. And as an imaginary rule, asked them to think like scientists, because of course in school, they're not technically scientists, so they're imagining that. And then we didn't list the rules for them. These are the rules they've been exploring in those other activities. So here you can see, first, the children often went over to the block, and this child is showing us how they smelled the flower to see if it had good nectar. And there's definitely some silliness here. Kids are laughing as the child rubs their nose across the block, but it's also a key part of the model. And then they really enjoyed this part. They really exaggerated rubbing your leg on the flower as you got into it or left it, because that's how pollen would get on there. So this, again, was a really nice decision, I think, on their part, because we can see they're having a blast and they're being silly about it. So it feels playful, but it's also one of the most important scientific rules we wanted them to model, which is that accidental capturing of the pollen by the bees. So as I was saying, silly, playful, but also much more normative, driven by these normative ideas. And so again, we see that looking across these, the different types of rules and ideas coming from the imaginary and from the scientific discipline are supporting each other. And so even though this felt more like a model, an important piece here is that it's still imaginative and playful. It's not being shunned that they're giggling or rolling their legs around, and the teacher isn't saying, would it be really flop over the entire top of the flower? I've seen teachers say that, but they're not here. They're allowing that as part of the model, and kids really seem to buy into it. So when we look across these, it is a bit of a spectrum, but we see how some of those non-normative features, that freedom overpowered that first activity, which is why we consider it less successful. Although the teacher was able to salvage some of it in discussion and saying, well, what might have done this? Is that real? We ended up dropping it because everything else worked fine, so we didn't bother trying to fix it, but in the future we could potentially. And then this middle activity, like I mentioned, felt like both were doing some nice work for us. We saw the kids imagining what it was to be a bee in that virtual space, and then the embedded rules they really attended to. And those were coming from the software, although at other times they could come from us. And then finally, we saw something that looked a lot more scientifically normative, but was still playful and built on some of those ideas they uncovered in play. So we didn't have them read a book and then act this out. We had them play and play and play, and then they produced that model. So what I'd like to suggest, besides having been nice and useful, and elsewhere we've written about how embodiment plays a role here, is that thinking about these different types of activities along the spectrum helps us see how some of the features of play support representation, also how thinking of it as a representation shows the value of the play context and the imaginary situation. And to me, that's much more, we could debate whether any of these really is play, and maybe only the left one is play and the middle one might almost be, and if we had intercoder reliability, maybe no one counts the right one as play, but that to me seems like a far less useful exercise than being able to say, well, let's understand how students' representations are driven and where they're building on their imagination and what kind of work that's doing. And so hopefully you can see some of the power here. And so now to really test out this idea, I wanted to take it away from young children and think about another study we did, which was at the undergraduate level. This one was called Cities on the Edge of War. It's about as far away from honeybees as you can get. And there is a paper that we presented at ICLS. Christina Stiso and Zach Ryan, who are here, were part of that. And Eric Robinson is the history professor who invited us into his classroom and co-designed the game with us. So Cities on the Edge of War was an undergraduate history course at a large Midwestern university. You don't need to guess where it is, but this was primarily history majors. And students played this game that we designed over the whole semester. This was not a 1 hour one-off. We designed it to be played for 12 of the 16 weeks of class. And so the students really spent the semester playing one game twice, each play being 5 weeks and change. They also did some more typical reflections and wrote up some speeches so that we could still grade them as if it were a traditional history course. But Every day they came in and played the game and then they left. So here, if we think about this representationally, the idea is that in this case, we're comparing it with history as a discipline. And we're particularly interested in how the students came to appreciate some of the geographical, political, and military issues that were present in this particular historical context leading up to the Peloponnesian War, which was the big Sparta-Athens war in ancient Greece. And what we know from the history learning literature is that this is really hard for students in large part because taking the perspective of historical actors is challenging. Students are driven by a presentist focus, which loosely translates to, well, they were just silly. If it were modern day, they'd get it. And we see this in a lot of the history classes we work with. And so we wanted to find ways to help them take on that perspective. And one way that people have done this is a role-playing game called Reacting to the Past, where they have students just play act these roles with each other from some historical context in order to understand the tensions. And we had played with that idea and tried it out, but we wanted to do more. And so in particular, we wanted to bring in features of board games in order to really help drive some of these connections here between the game and the geographical, political, and military issues. So we put features in the game to make those as salient as possible for the players or students. And so let me summarize the game for you a little bit. So students, this, as I mentioned, was set in the lead up to the Peloponnesian War. The class was divided into groups, which all were different city-states, the two large ones being Athens and Sparta, and then there were 9 smaller city-states. Each player had a clearly defined role, but some ill-defined goals. So for example, here's the oligarch from Corinth who wanted to fight for the survival and prosperity of Corinth, but also diminishing the Athenian influence. And these were based on historical motivations, but this is relatively vague so that each student could decide how to pursue this goal throughout the course of the game / semester, however they wanted. As a strategy game, students also had to choose actions as a city-state. So each city-state had to choose from 13 different actions and play 2 of those to choose what they were going to do. So for example, they could choose to seek the favor of the gods, which is something that would have fit historically. And in terms of gameplay, if they were successful, they would get a benefit like being able to roll an extra die at war. But this was intended to lead them to negotiate within their city-state and talk about why they would want to do things and what their city-state's motivations would be. And then we had armies and all the kinds of things you can imagine from a modern board game, to lots of little bits to help them think about it. And they were playing on a map of ancient Greece that we set up. So here we gave them a printed version of this with plastic figures that we stole from a board game, well, borrowed because we paid for the board game, so they could maneuver all their troops. But then we also had this set up as a Google Doc so that we could update it in real time during the class and they could all look at it on their laptops and see what was happening in the game. And the way we were trying to capture those rules of the history were to help the students take on these different perspectives. And these were identified by the professor, Eric Robinson, who had taught the traditional class in the past. And he really wanted the students to be able to think about the historical context as someone responding to those events, someone leading a faction, such as the democratic faction or the oligarchic wealthy in a city-state. Also, just a regular member of any given city-state. How would I think differently as a member of Sparta versus Athens? But there was also something that tied all of Greece together at the time, which was the fear of the Persians invading, and he wanted the students to connect to that. And then finally, he wanted them to occasionally be able to step outside of that and think like a historian and think like a student of history, because it couldn't be all fun and games. So we collected lots of video data. We had 2 static cameras and small 360 cameras on students' tables. We collected their work. And then ultimately we analyzed this by looking at the video and logging it and iteratively reviewing it with an eye towards when we saw students take up these perspectives. So first, just jumping ahead, their final exam scores looked to the professor slightly better than in similar courses that he'd taught in the past. And the students did show an improved understanding of the historical context in their papers over time. And in particular, he noticed that they had a much greater focus on the big picture questions. So while students in other courses ignored some of those big tensions between Sparta and Athens and Persia, those were really, really present. Some of the smaller details, he said, got lost, but in the grand scheme of things, those were less important. From an engagement standpoint, we had the vast majority of the students said this was the best class they had ever taken, either in history or at IU or in their lives. And this was on the anonymous course evaluation at the end of the semester. So we're pretty confident that they loved it as much as we thought they did. So what does that look like? Here is an example where Hyperbolus is making a debate. He's making a speech about what should happen in the next course of events. And here we can see a mix again of the imaginary and the disciplinary rules. So this is spontaneous to try and convince people. But he's basing his arguments on the way Greeks at the time supposedly were thinking about issues based on the readings, not based on what anyone in the class had said. He was imagining, you'll see, he's quite imaginative and quite the actor, and he's bringing that all in. He's also talking about these imaginary game events that don't necessarily mirror what happened in the real world, but he's talking about historical motivations in terms of wanting to be a united Greece. So I'm gonna play this video so you can see what that looks like.
And talk about the freedom of the Greek city-states, and yet what did I see in Methemna? Oh, our fellow allies asked for our help. Oh, yes, we saw that. It was a raid against a fellow Athenian ally, a Delian League member. As far as I'm concerned, but what it looks like is someone is willing to pay in the blood of the people of Rhodes and Cnidus and Methemna for their own gain. I see a rebellion, not against Athens, but of the ideal of what it means to be a Greek. Our peace and order and security lays with our willingness to cooperate and agree with a decided line with the Persian Empire. If we fail to do that, we will sink the entire Hellenic world into a war which we are not prepared to fight. This will lead to the destitution of our people and our posterity. And that is something we simply cannot allow. And to talk about.
So how many of you would guess that's a theater major, just out of curiosity? I'm pleased to say it turns out he was a secondary ed major who is probably teaching history now, although unfortunately online. But what's important here, it's hard to tell without knowing all the details, but he's drawing really nicely on a mix of the historical motivations that are key to the game and key to the primary sources the students are reading, and everything that just happened in the game. And I don't know what your undergraduate classrooms look like, but the amount of attention he's getting from his peers, even when they make that "whoa" sound, that is at a time that's accurate for the imagined situation. It's not because he said something that was provocative to upset the professor, right? So they're really buying in and connecting to this game world in ways that seem to be quite powerful. And of course, this can go the other direction. So it's a little hard to follow some of this video, but what you're seeing happen here, Lysander, who is this student in the blue shirt, has just decided to try and usurp one of the kings of Sparta. And the person playing the king of Sparta to be usurped is quite unsatisfied with this, is quite frustrated and taking it personally. And so the professor is intervening and talking about it a little bit. But what's important here is that the reason Lysander did that is not because he doesn't like this person. In fact, he told us he felt bad afterwards, but it's because he read ahead and Lysander tries to take over Sparta. And so he was doing what he was supposed to historically. And of course, the king doesn't respond well to that. So we see a mix of features here.
Will, because both these people supported it. We have one king and
But
two
I get to
people,
play the second
but you get to
card.
play the second card.
Okay.
However, this gets resolved immediately, so you don't get to do, so this built political support you could use in a future turn, but you wouldn't, you know, so you are doing this, or have we decided? You are, you aren't?
I've decided yes.
Okay, so Lysander is going to do this first with the support of one king and one other. Then you, and you guys can obviously talk about it,
How
can
did you
choose,
just put down 2 first?
and he only gets the first. And then you guys decide, you get to decide the
What do you
second.
want to do?
I don't even know now. You gotta give her the card so she can
We
decide.
can seek a or you could still build internal political support in case he fails, so you can't try to do it again.
Yeah, I guess that's. Well, I'm only suppressed for a year if I fail, so. Yeah.
That is true.
All right, you
My
guys
thing
decide.
is, I understand why.
Okay, I'll stop there. But one of the reasons we think this is exciting, besides, I mean, we don't want an upset student, but she was able to move on, fortunately. But the students are taking these roles quite seriously, and we see here how some of the game mechanics are paralleling the historical realities in ways that made those underlying rules salient to the students. So when Lysander tries to take over, he needs to get some people to back him. And at that point, it's too late for the king to overrule it, although the king can start building a coalition to come back later. And so we saw a lot of these dynamics over time. And then one last example of that, we saw here, Theramenes is building up his own personal goals as a player in the game to replicate the historical features, and he basically betrays his city, which is Athens. So even though he, as far as we could tell, is friendly, gets along with the entire group, etc., the professor is now asked what's going to happen when Sparta marches up to Athens, and he now repeatedly says, "I'll open the door for them." And so you can see him back there.
Thank you. So this is going to be plus. It is. Once again, everyone's like drowning at him.
So it's a little chaotic, but basically the class clearly appreciates the humor of Theramenes repeatedly trying to open the door to Sparta to march in. And so there's, again, this playful, fun activity is representing key features of the historical context in ways that are quite powerful and recognizable to the professor.
Thank you.
Now, of course, we did want other ways to show learning. So in the students' writing, we see this similar mix. Here, a student's referencing some of the primary sources and recognizing the difference. Well, in real history, they write, Athens would eventually lose the war. And then moving ahead, but in the game world, they completely avoided that in a way fairly similar to the brief piece in the midpoint. So now there's some additional compare and contrast between what happened to us in the game and how that was analogous to different features of the real history, right? Making it visible. So the imaginary making the rules of the discipline clear. And also some thinking ahead. Right, so here they're noting that in the game, Sparta was in fact trying to corral her allies in order to avoid some of the same problems that happened historically. And so students are exploring those motivations and really asking themselves pragmatically, what could I have done differently if I were ruling Sparta? And it's not just a navel-gazing act, but they can actually affect the entire game world. So coming back here, we see that those game mechanisms really did what we wanted them to do, which was to let the students connect to the primary sources, which seemed to, in turn, lead the students to also reflect on the game in new ways, which led them to then look back at the historical texts in additional ways, in powerful ways. And we could also see this in their writing. Now, if we take this one step further, looking at this as representational also helps us to make some conjectures about which features of the imaginary situation in the game world are making what features of the discipline visible. So for example, unpacking this a bit, we see that the goals that the students had to take up as individual characters, sometimes made up characters, made some of those political tensions quite salient to them. We can see how using speeches also led them to draw upon those historical and political features, and how using the map and the cards helped them to recognize some of the real tensions. So I didn't show any video of this, but it took students a long time to move armies across the Greek world because, of course, you couldn't fly Greek soldiers around during the Peloponnesian War. It would take months to move them around, and we wanted to replicate that in the game. And so they found that quite frustrating, but really came to appreciate how that paralleled what it would have been like as a king or a leader back during the Peloponnesian War. So, and representing the game design this way also helped us think about ways we might change it. So, for example, we saw that it was probably most fun for Sparta and Athens because they were the big military powers at the time. They had bigger groups. And so we've been thinking about how to insert additional goals when we replay this game next spring for the smaller city-states so they can stay engaged, but do so in ways that are historically meaningful. So we don't want them to just suddenly generate trading empires that didn't exist, but to tie those goals to features of the history. I've been learning a lot from my colleague who's the historian here, and gosh, I wish I had learned history this way when I was an undergrad, to put it simply. And really, we also want to think about additional ways for them to draw on the primary sources. There were some students like Lysander who drew on the readings to guide their actions. There were others who seemed to just do the reading right before the assignments. And so we're thinking about ways to tweak both the game and the class activities to make those disciplinary norms a little bit more visible and balance them even better with the imaginary playful situation. And really develop those historical practices that are so key for a history professor who's going to have students get a good grade in their class. So in short, I think that looking at play and representations together as a way to understand their overlapping features can be quite powerful. We can still learn a lot from play, and I don't want to do away with existing definitions of play, but I think methodologically, this has proven for me at least to be quite powerful. And in particular, helps me think about the role of the imaginary situation in both play and representation, as well as the sources and influence of normative rules as they come into play for students, either during free play or academic play or scientific modeling, and really helps us, for me, starts to make more salient this mechanism of learning and engagement in play. It helps to move away from the sort of frame that play is just great and playing is good, to here's the ways we can use play to support engaging with academic content. And if we can understand some of those, we can then better design for playful learning and think about how to refine those designs. So when it doesn't work, it doesn't mean we completely failed, but we can really have concrete conjectures about which features of the rules or the imaginary situation are supposed to take on what role and can reflect on how they succeeded or not. And then not to brush this aside, but this helps, I hope, with the rhetorical argument with folks who study play, but it also helps us when we talk to teachers who say, ooh, if I tell the parents this is all about play, they're going to be frustrated, but if we call it modeling and play like modeling, sure, that's going to sell the parents. I think it's unfortunate that play gets a bad rap, but I'm hoping that positioning play as representational helps us to highlight some of the academic benefits of play. Although as a side note, I don't want to lose free play and all of its developmental features for kids. I just want to make sure we have good ways of bringing more play into the academic side of things because it can be so powerful. And finally, I think this made even more salient for me how representing and representational practices, particularly for novices, are not driven solely by observing the world. But it's easy to forget that. And we see even in studies of professional scientists, like the work by Eleanor Oakes, that professional scientists also take on imaginary playful roles to think about the world, or Einstein famously talking about what it might have meant to ride a beam of light, right? That's very playful and imaginative and help drive his work. And so we want to keep that as part of the discussion. So finally, if it's not obvious, this was not an individual effort. I'm building on a massive amount of work done with colleagues, students who are also colleagues, many of whom have joined us here today. So thank you all for coming. And thank you very much for listening patiently to a really long Zoom talk.